Both my parents had died, as I've told you already. And since no one wanted me, they didn't know what to do with me. Mrs. Thomas was a poor woman who came in to clean, and she said she'd take me. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas moved away from Bolingbroke to Marysville, and I lived with them until I was 8 years old. I looked after their children. There were 4 of them, younger than me. She was a very kind lady, but he often shouted at us. And when the younger children cried because they were scared of him, I was punished. It was a trying time for me. I liked the little Thomas children, but I was still little myself. I gave them all the love that I had always longed for. And then Mr. Thomas was killed falling under a train. We were shocked when we heard what had happened. Although we hadn't liked him all that much, we had never wished him such an end. Mrs. Thomas went to live with Mr. Thomas's mother, but she didn't want me. Then Mrs. Hammond from up the river came along and said she'd take me, seeing I was good with children. I went up the river to live with her in a little clearing among the tree stumps. It was a very lonesome place. There were no flowers. I imagined the desert must look exactly like that. I'm sure I could never have lived there if I hadn't had an imagination. Everything was grey and dark. There were no colours anywhere. Mr. Hammond worked a little sawmill up there, and Mrs. Hammond had 8 children. She had twins 3 times. I like babies in moderation, but twins 3 times in succession is too much. I told Mrs. Hammond so firmly when the last pair arrived. I used to get so dreadfully tired carrying them around. 8 children are simply too much for a girl of my age. If she continued carrying on as she had, the 8 children might easily have become 12 or even 14. It was my duty to teach the Hammond children to walk. And then we suffered through that unbearably cold winter. Mr. Hammond died of pneumonia, and Mrs. Hammond broke up the household. She divided her children among her relatives and went to live in the United States. Of course, no one wanted me. Who wants an orphan with red hair anyway? I had to go to the orphanage in Hopetown because no one would take me. They didn't want me at the orphanage either. They said they were overcrowded as it was, but in the end they had to take me in. And I was to stay there for 4 months, until the other day when Mrs. Spencer came, Miss Cuthbert.
Did you ever go to school during those years?
Yes, I did. Not a great deal, unfortunately. When I lived with Mrs. Hammond, we were so far from the school that I couldn't walk there in winter, and there was vacation in the summer, so I could only go in the spring and fall. Of course, I went there while I was at the orphanage. I can read pretty well, and I know ever so many pieces of poetry off by heart. I just love poetry, and I have a very good memory. When my mother and father died, I was fortunate enough to inherit all their books, and when I was big enough, I read them all. The problem is I read these books so often I learnt them off by heart. But sadly, they all landed in the rubbish when Mrs. Hammond gave up her children and housekeeping and moved to the United States of America.
Tell me, girl, were those 2 women, I mean Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, you were telling me about, were they good to you?
They really meant to be good to me, I'm sure, but they had a good deal to worry them, Miss Cuthbert. They simply didn't have time to worry about an orphan like me. It's very trying to live with a drunken husband, you see, and to have twins 3 times in succession. But I feel sure they meant to be good to me. Both of them had very good hearts, Miss Cuthbert. I have absolutely no doubt that they both meant to be just as good and kind as possible. I desperately tried to help, but at the same time I was merely an additional burden to them. I was an extra hungry mouth to feed, and it must have been very difficult for them, Miss Cuthbert. When you carefully consider all of this, I must admit that both of them were really very good to me.
Marilla asked no more questions. She guided the horse while she pondered deeply. She couldn't help feeling sorry for the child. What an unloved life she'd led, a life of drudgery, poverty, and neglect. It was a pity she had to be sent back. What if she, Marilla, should indulge Matthew's unaccountable whim and let her stay? He had his heart set on it, and the child seemed to have potential. But what would be the sensible thing to do? Marilla had always regarded herself as utterly sensible.
I'm very grateful to you, Miss Cuthbert, you know. Once, when I lived in Marysville, Mr. Thomas took us all to spend the day at the seaside. I enjoyed every moment of that day. Not even the fact that I had to look after all those children all day long to keep them from drowning spoilt it for me. I felt so sorry for those poor little children who never had the opportunity to learn to swim as I did. Oh, my girls! Don't you think it would be nice to be a gull? To wake up at sunrise and swoop down over the water, and up and away out over that lovely blue sea all day long, and then at night to fly straight back to your own nest. Could you please tell me what that big white house is that I see in the distance, Miss Cuthbert? Oh, I do hope with all my heart it isn't Mrs. Spencer's place.
No, that's the White Sands Hotel. Many Americans stay there during the summer when they're on vacation here on Prince Edward Island.
Oh, I was so afraid it might be Mrs. Spencer's place. I don't want us to get there so soon. Somehow, Miss Cuthbert, when we get there, it'll seem like the end of everything.
Although Anne wished that the journey would never end, she knew it was unrealistic. They would soon meet Mrs. Spencer, and a decision about her future would then be taken. But she hadn't quite given up hope that she might be allowed to stay at Green Gables forever.